Boa tarde para quem está chegando. Good evening or good afternoon. For those who are here on our Zoom webinar or following us through YouTube, we are waiting for we're waiting for the YouTube streaming to start, and then we will start our events. Então, boa tarde ou boa noite, dependendo de onde estamos, ou bom dia. Nós estamos esperando iniciar a transmissão no YouTube também do nosso evento, e aí vamos dar início aí à nossa 20ª Semana da Imagem. Ok, já recebi o aviso de que a transmissão no YouTube já começou. Então, olá a todas e todos, sejam bem-vindas e bem-vindos à 20ª edição da Semana da Imagem, promovida pelo Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciências da Comunicação da Unisinos, em especial pela linha de pesquisa Mídias e Processos Audiovisuais e o Grupo de Pesquisa Audiovisualidades da Tecnocultura, Comunicação, Memória e Design. É uma satisfação recebê-los aqui no nosso evento. Fizemos uma programação que mistura convidados internacionais, colegas que já estiveram conosco em outras edições da Semana da Imagem, assim como também a participação de egressos do nosso grupo, finalizando a nossa semana. Meu nome é Gustavo Fischer, eu sou coordenador do Grupo de Pesquisa Audiovisualidades da Tecnocultura, junto com a minha colega Suzana Kilp, e também com os professores Thiago Lopes e João Pittencourt. Compomos aí os professores, junto com os nossos alunos de mestrado, doutorado e iniciação científica, compomos o grupo TCAv, o qual promove a Semana da Imagem. Antes da gente falar da nossa programação, eu gostaria de reforçar alguns pontos com relação à parte da logística aqui do evento. Aqueles que estão nos acompanhando no YouTube e, por acaso, estiverem com alguma dificuldade com relação ao acesso à tradução, estão convidados a se juntar aqui no Zoom, para que possam aí escolher o canal de áudio em inglês ou português para acompanhar a transmissão. Vou pedir para o pessoal aqui dos nossos alunos colocarem o link ali no chat do YouTube, para que a gente possa também, vocês possam escolher, entrar na plataforma para nos acompanhar da mesma maneira. Com relação aqui à nossa plataforma, a gente tem um botão aí de perguntas que podem ser feitas ao palestrante ao longo da fala, e depois a gente vai respondendo e comentando, e também, é claro, na medida do possível, podemos até eventualmente liberar microfones, câmera para perguntas mais diretas, se for o caso. Vou aqui fazer uma breve introdução sobre o nosso evento. A Semana da Imagem, ela começou em 1999, por iniciativa do então Grupo de Estudos da Imagem na Comunicação, com vistas à abordagem de referenciais teóricos e criativos compartilhados. Dessa necessidade, partiu-se para a criação de um fórum ampliado de debates que deu origem ao evento. A Semana da Imagem, então, teve 8 edições anuais sucessivas até 2005, sempre com produtiva repercussão entre professores e alunos da graduação e da pós-graduação. Com a criação do grupo de pesquisa, que eu já denominei aqui, Audiovisualidades e Tecnocultura, naquela época, Comunicação, Memória e Design, esse grupo reassumiu a realização do evento a partir de 2010. Nessa retomada, a gente pôde incrementar ainda mais essa relação entre pós-graduação, graduação e mercado, e chegamos hoje, após diversas edições, inclusive atravessando aí a pandemia e indo para o formato remoto, no 20º ano, e aberto agora, né, mais do que nunca, a todos os públicos, reafirmando a centralidade da tecnocultura para pensar os fenômenos imagéticos audiovisuais contemporâneos. A gente entende que essa centralidade é bastante produtiva para fazer avançar o estado da arte da comunicação, pensando as imagens nesse mundo contemporâneo que nos cerca e cada vez nos desafia mais. Para aqueles que estão também entrando em contato pela primeira vez com o evento, nós também reforçamos que as outras edições anteriores se encontram no nosso canal do YouTube, com diversas palestras e debates. Nessa semana, que iniciamos hoje e encerraremos na quinta-feira, nós temos no dia de hoje o professor Peter Krapp, da Universidade de Califórnia, Vale, onde eu também me encontro nesse momento num período de pós-doutoramento. Já vou apresentar o Peter de maneira mais detalhada. Amanhã, no mesmo horário, temos a professora Lori Emerson, da Universidade de Colorado, que vai falar sobre práticas de laboratório ligadas à arqueologia da mídia, né, a partir do livro Lab Book, que ela coautorou. Na quarta-feira, dia 9, nós temos o Bruno Moreschi, um pesquisador da USP, que vai trabalhar com o tema Ver e Praticar a Visão Computacional. E na quinta-feira, dia 10, teremos a exibição de 2 curtas-metragens. Um se chama É Assim Que Eu Me Lembro, do nosso egresso do doutorado Guilherme Pires, e Meu Pai Vestido de Trabalhador, da nossa egressa de mestrado Ana Lu Favreto. Nesse dia 10, então, também faremos um debate com os nossos realizadores que tiveram passagem aqui pelo nosso grupo. Então, é nessa perspectiva, né, que nós damos as boas-vindas a todos e todas, nesse novembro de uma especial Primavera Brasileira. Com isso, eu vou passar aqui eu só quero conferir, estão todos me ouvindo bem, me parece, né? Até agora não recebi nenhuma outra informação. Então, vou passar aqui para apresentar o professor Peter Krapp. O Peter Krapp é professor de Estudos de Cinema e Mídias na UCI, né? E suas principais publicações incluem Déjà Vu, Aberrations of Cultural Memory, e Noise Channel, Glitch and Error in Digital Culture. Seus interesses de pesquisa são memória cultural, história e teoria dos gadgets, jogos e simulações nas representações cinematográficas e digitais. É um grande parceiro de atividades do TCAv, aqui do grupo, né? Participando da Semana da Imagem já em 2018 e também em 2020, ali, na antessala do início da pandemia, o Peter esteve conosco. Peter, I would like to thank you once again very much for giving us the honor of opening our Image Week, which you are somehow familiar with. You are now in Germany, and so we have a third time zone involved here. And thank you once again. You have the floor, and I'll be here if you need me, and also eager to get on to the debate as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for including me in this Zoom conference. And I apologize in advance, not only to the attendees, but also to the interpreter, to the translator, because it was not easy to prepare a set of slides and remarks across 2 continents. But I'm going to share some slides. 1 second. You should be seeing them now. The topic of my presentation is the curious fact that at some point in the early 1990s, a number of countries suddenly opened computer museums, or rather a number of computer museums opened in a number of different countries, presenting the history of computing as if it was logically resulting in our being on the internet as we are right now. So the question during COVID, during COVID-19 coronavirus times, of course, is how museums can maintain presence, and they've gone online even more. So now the question becomes, is the internet in fact itself a museum of computing? Right, so I make a distinction between a computer museum, which is an exhibit of old computers, and a museum of computing, which is a human activity of communication with other people and with machines. So I'm trying to think of museums as media in respects other than their community of role, as museum scholar Michelle Henning has suggested. And I'm looking at this kind of Mobius strip that is the museum of computing, but also museums on the computer. Right? So the question is really rephrased as, how does the computer get into the museum? And how does the museum get into the networked computer? As my colleague Jeff Bowker said, information technology constitutes the twist in this Mobius strip that takes us from arguments internal to a field, how is the past conceptualized in the case of historical science, to its exterior, how is information about that past stored. Of course, the internet is not a museum in any conventional sense, but then computers are not conventional media either. And a range of scholars have argued that the internet may actually be the most appropriate way to assemble, consult, commemorate, and musealize what we know about computing. Inversely, we have to wonder to what extent computer history museums actually do justice, not just to computer history, but to the history of computing, from analog and early digital machines to mainframes, and from mini computers and microcomputers to the creation of decentralized networks, up to and including the history of the internet. Of course, it's obvious that there is a history of the internet, and our history is on the internet. But it nonetheless raises the question, what is the history of the internet a history of? How does our heavily computerized civilization cultivate awareness of its own historical conditions of possibility? But when computing is so relentlessly hurtling into the future, how does the history of computing suddenly become museum-worthy in the 1990s? Some critics see in this development the exhaustion of our institutional and individual capacity for coping with innovation and cultural memory. Others are worrying that never before has so much been recorded, collected, never has remembering been so compulsive. So observers are divided between those who like to see the net hoover up all our digital traces and those who wonder about the trash, cruft, detritus, and intentionally opaque hoard of documents and artifacts that constitute that digital archive. So what would be the argument for historic preservation of the net? When do we get to process what the internet was, what it has become today, and what it prompts us to do next? Can there be a museum of computing that is also a museum of the internet and possibly a museum on the internet, whether by that we mean the infrastructure and the backbone, or maybe even the full interactive culture that we try to protect and preserve for posterity? Surely it's hard to imagine how one might study the history of our contemporary world in the late 20th and early 21st century without recourse to the archived web. As more and more of the primary sources of interest to scholars, to historians, to witnesses such as news and correspondence and public records, etc., are online, which is also driving more museums to be online. But on the other hand, can computer history in general and internet history in particular lend itself to a museological approach, or are there other approaches offering themselves that promise to do better? And once museums do go online, who gets to represent what about the internet to whom on the internet? As a model for developments in the museum, the internet brings with itself issues in relation to power that are just as complex as those found in the traditional model of the museum, the traditional 19th century museum, I should say. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of museums, but I'm really more interested in the history of computing, not of computers necessarily, but of computing. The methods of memorializing, of commemorating, of selecting and excluding, emphasizing and eliding are implicit and explicit constraints on a survey of how museums represent computers and the internet, and how the internet represents computers and its own history and prehistory. There's even now an exhibit calling itself the Museum of the Fossilized Internet that aims to raise awareness for sustainable technology, because the internet, of course, draws a lot of energy and uses up a lot of hard-to-replace ingredients, such as rare earths, etc. And the curators of the Museum of the Fossilized Internet aim to raise awareness for sustainable technology in virtual tours that seek to put the coal and oil-powered internet of the past behind us. So if museums are already unreal, or as Foucault said, heterotopic spaces in which the time of accumulation never stops building up a collection catering to any number of epochs, forms, and tastes, they seek to establish this perpetual hoard that they then can protect from the ravages of time, of decay, and of shifting contexts, of bit rot, and of oblivion. So there's no doubt that the internet has technical and cultural dimensions worthy of being appreciated and protected against decay and disappearance. If I could see you and if we could interact a little, we could talk a little bit about which aspects of internet culture in particular and of computing more broadly you all think are worthy of preserving for posterity. But the fact is the history is rarely appreciated, it's rapidly decaying, and it's too often deeply misunderstood and badly misrepresented, even by many of those who purport to save it. Because version control and persistence are explicitly not part of its architecture from the start, a fact that is much deplored by internet pioneers like Ted Nelson, who has been pointing out tirelessly that what we have now, what we live with, trivializes our original hypertext model with one-way, ever-breaking links and no management of version or content. There's even this exhibit that I'm showing you here quickly on the webpage of the Museum of Media History devoted to Nelson's project Xanadu, which documents the failures of incorporating version control into the net. And the mission of the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, of course, is partly to remedy that lack. Here we are working at university. Many of us, universities used to run their own information technology, but it's now become largely outsourced to the dominant global platforms. And so we're no longer in charge of our own email servers, our own web servers, et cetera. They're all outsourced to corporate powers. So there's even less control over the history of the website of the institution that I work for. I couldn't show you what UC Irvine looked like online 5 years or 10 years or 15 years or 20 years ago. There are any number of missing narratives of the internet, and museums are trying to be part of the response. Scholarship goes in search of net histories that show how much of what we call the internet now is just as much mythology as technology. It's a shared set of narratives that frame our expectation of the future. And that's why we shouldn't dismiss museums as, a marginal appearance that doesn't really influence what happens next. Museums play a very important role in helping explain and raise expectations both of our present and our future in terms of computer-mediated communication. So our expectations from computers and from the internet for filing, archiving, conservation, memory show that arguably the computer itself has fundamentally redefined our concept of memory. And of course, a museum can be defined, I'm not making this up, but I'm citing a UNESCO definition. Museum can be defined as a permanent institution in the service of society, which acquires and conserves, researches, and communicates the tangible and intangible heritage at stake for the purposes of education, of study, and enjoyment. By the same token, this means that we need to examine, when and why and how do museums of computing pop up. Now that we have them, of course, we see that as a consequence of the pandemic, a lot of those very tech-savvy museum employees are offering more online services. So museums are all going online. The expansion of museum offerings on the internet has renewed interest also in kind of an older notion, namely André Malraux's notion of the virtual museum, which he formulated in 1947. It appears to preempt the so much of our current discourse on the virtual and the digital. He pointed out that the 19th century museum prefigured mass media as purveyors of modes of representation, new technologies of reproduction that led to new art forms and media artifacts. And so he wanted to instigate a virtual, an imaginary museum. His imaginary museum was neither simply a self-imposed restriction to reproductions, nor abandoning the museum as an institution, as a building, as a place, but rather a curatorial act as a work of art. It's not to replace, but to extend the exhibitionary impulse. And that's what museums do today when they go online. They say, we realize you might not feel comfortable coming in physically to the space, so we're going to meet you online. Or in some cases, in many cases, I've been canvassing computer museums worldwide. I'm going to another one tomorrow and another one next week while I'm still working in Europe temporarily. They sometimes had to close and are not planning to reopen because they've gone fully digital. So we can say that to understand what is new about the ways in which museums organize and operate within global networks also means looking at quite specific matters concerning, for example, the technical means of organizing those networks, which could mean the internet contrasted or compared with earlier networks such as the rail or navigation, telegraphy, or telecommunications as forms of expertise that they help interconnect. Proponents of network computing argue very persuasively that access to cultural assets should be extended beyond exhibition spaces that can sometimes feel inhibiting or elitist to capture economies of scale. Bring the museum to everybody, especially to those people who can't come to the museum. So while museum exhibits tend to display a small percentage of their actual holdings, web museums can potentially offer a lot more. They can show a lot more, they can share. But the topic becomes far more complex when we consider the internet as a cultural asset itself and seek to capture its history in that curated exhibit in the Möbius strip that I'm talking about. Right? So if the museum genealogically is an epistemological structure, then certainly so is the internet. In this context, Wolfgang Ernst has argued that, I quote, the inventoried collection is no longer the long-term database of a given past, nor is memory any longer assumed to be a stable condition of a future historiography, but something to be maintained on an as-needed basis. The internet itself, he says, constitutes the appropriate mode. Even a cursory search will turn up lots and lots of virtual museums of computing, leveraging the net and its increasing capacity for high-resolution communications for the display of and interaction with representations of computer history, including the history of the net. There's a Swiss Museum of Computing, enter.ch in Solothurn, that offers a virtual walkthrough of its old exhibits, while it awaits the completion of a new building to house its physical exhibits, probably not until after the end of next year. There is a Stuttgart University Computer Museum that puts short documentary videos about their collections on YouTube, and every now and then is also streaming on Twitch, because it's not something that people can physically visit. Sometimes virtual computers museums are online extensions of museums of computing. For example, the virtual museum project of the Monash Museum of Computing History, which exhibits images of a Ferranti Sirius and a PDP-9 before pointing to computer networks, legitimizing its online presence. And sometimes those kinds of museums are purely virtual without physical collections. A decade ago, at a conference on making the history of computing relevant, convened by the London Science Museum in June 2013, a presentation about internet history opened with this ambivalent sentiment. I quote Mark Webber: "The online world and its origins is one of the most obviously relevant areas of computing history to the general public. It's also one of the hardest to effectively interpret and display." The speaker, Mark Webber, works as Internet History Curator at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, which was launched there. The Internet History program was launched in 2009 to tell stories, including its own stories, as the first comprehensive exhibit about the history of the online world. But it doesn't simply display routers and wires, servers and switches, satellites and radio towers, because while all that infrastructure might be impressive to those people who know what that is and what that does, the magic that eventually brings our screens to life is all on the inside, invisible. Also barely visible are the marks of the decades-long standards wars that form much of the history of networking, right? So you don't just exhibit what you can see with hindsight. You should perhaps explain how we got here, and perhaps even try to explain that we could have gone different places if we had made different decisions at certain crucial points in the past. A computer history museum begins with 19th century telecommunications equipment before getting to packet switching networks for computing since the 1960s. And in the key didactic decisions, visitors can follow two separate tracks, one about connecting computers and the other one about connecting people. History of computers, history of computing. And they highlight how the web is distinct from, but reliant on the net. A very similar distinction is made by relevant galleries of the Science Museum in London, where they foreground that the history of computing is not simply a lineage of devices, and they have an information age gallery that encompasses more than 2 centuries of networking, from Morse and telegraph wires to radio and television broadcasts and onto satellite, internet, and cell phone communications. Each of these 6 networks occupies a showcase that is within sight of the other 5. So where there's still displays of rare and invaluable devices, the story told is not just of musealizing communications, but of connections, shifting the emphasis to you as a user. So it's worth noting, as I said at the beginning, that these attempts to grapple with computer history were rather marginal until recently, and that museums of computing are a phenomenon that only starts up in the 1990s. There's a little bit of a prehistory. The Charles Babbage Institute in Minnesota and the History of Computing Committee of the American Federation of Information Processing Societies were both founded in 1978. That's also kind of much later than the history of computing proper has begun. And they together produced a brochure called Preserving Computer-Related Source Materials, which was distributed at the National Computer Conference in 1979. But what it called to collect was initially just papers. papers, concepts, ideas, descriptions. And the recommendations barely considered executable code or legacy hardware for any of their, quote, aesthetic or sentimental value, right? So in the 70s, nobody thought that computers and their software could have aesthetic value or sentimental value or didactic or any other value for that matter. What mattered to them was the history of ideas at that point. And most computer museums did not follow that. So it's interesting to figure out what it means that the idea to exhibit computers and to have people interact with legacy machines, what does that mean? Why does that come up in the decade before the end of the 20th century? I'm going to suggest that it's not a coincidence that it's also the decade when the internet was privatized and quickly became ubiquitous, and also when a lot of money was being made with the internet, and some of that money went back into telling the story of the internet. The first collections and exhibitions of computer history tended to be industry-driven and started as personal collections. Not only the Computer History Museum in Mountain View, which is important and influential and now open to the public, but it started as a converted closet at the computer company DEC, initiated by Ken Olsen and Gordon Bell, who ran the company. There is an amazing living computer museum in Seattle, also now closed, but it's by far the world's best collection of fully operational vintage computers from the private collection of Paul Allen. I don't know what's going to happen to it now that Paul Allen has passed away, but he employed a lot of people to constantly restore and preserve and run vintage computers. There are many other examples, and I'm, in the interest of being Zoom compatible today, I'm going to skip many other examples here. But let me just point out that by definition, a private collection is not yet a museum. It's just an evolutionary step in the museum's prehistory. It's a chamber of curiosity. It's something that you do for speculative or scholarly purposes or to brag. And museum scholars have wondered whether new media and the internet seem to imply new epistemological and aesthetic models, which have more in common with the private curiosity cabinets or Wunderkammern of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. Even the largest computer history museum on this planet, the Heinz Nixdorf Museums Forum in Paderborn, Germany, emerged in the 1990s out of the private collection of Heinz Nixdorf, who was a computer pioneer whose company was eventually sold to Siemens and then to IBM. Nixdorf had collected over 1,500 objects by the time of his death in 1987. And even though his foundation had envisioned a company-specific framework for their exhibition, eventually the scope was widened to 5 millennia of mathematics, writing, and communication. So this kind of collection, you have a selection of objects here on the screen, from the abacus to the computer, can be organized with different things in mind. They never have everything on display. And as at other computer history museums, the history of the internet itself is illustrated at the Heinz Nixdorf Forum by dint of evocative objects, including a teletext terminal, a next cube computer of the sort that Tim Berners-Lee used to develop the World Wide Web proposal, and even the Trojan Room coffee machine that was the first one to go and be online by webcam. Museum of computing often try to lure an audience in with two popular aspects of digital culture. They either emphasize gaming, and if you've been to a museum like that, you immediately recognize how games, video games, computer games can draw people into the computer and history of science context, or with the internet as the motivation why the internet audience ought to pay attention. The faster our computers operate objectively, the more pressing the subjective impression that the interfaces and affordances of present computing and networking environments no longer resemble those of the most recent past, let alone the distant ones. As Wolfgang Ernst points out, the internet constitutes a new type of trans-archive already present in Ted Nelson's conception of hypertext and hypermedia. It's a dynamic archive, the essence of which is permanent updating. So while it may appear superficially obvious what legacy systems are, this parlance in computer history is in fact messier and less straightforward than it seems. It can denote working but dated code. It can mean obsolete system. It can mean work that needs to be transcoded in order to interface with it. So it carries a lot of ambiguity of inheritance and burden discards, or just something in need of supplementation. Certainly, we're used to failure and obsolescence in computing. Gordon Bell, who I mentioned before, even proposed Bell's law for the birth and death of computer classes, which was, in his mind, a general theory for the creation, evolution, and obsolescence of computers since 1951. But that raises the question, is disappearance what drives a museum? Do we need a museum because things have become obsolete or defunct? And what about the apparently logical progression from vacuum computers to vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits to microchips? Is that really more than just hindsight? Right? These are just technological steps. They're not necessarily logical steps that lead to where we are today. It can seem that way from where we are, but it doesn't necessarily constitute robust history. Why would contemporary computing commemorate and venerate past iterations once they have fallen into disrepair and disuse? On the other hand, would a museum of the internet not be a premature epitaph? There are actually, and this is funny to me, there are actually real-world cemeteries that have websites, and there are internet-only cemeteries that commemorate the dead as a real cemetery would. There's at least one website outlining a procedure for memorializing websites that are no longer maintained or whose webmasters are deceased. It not only announces that there are such sites, it also offers a zipped download of their files. Quote, "At this site, you will find sites of value that have died." And of course, there are a number of internet museums themselves that are no longer on the internet. Their sites have deteriorated or moved, or their servers stopped responding. For example, the Virtual Museum of Computing was available between 2001, I think I had it up here, between 2001 and 2008, but no longer responds to my browser, although you can find 139 snapshots of it on the Wayback Machine. The Swiss Muda, Europe's first physical museum dedicated to digital art, was recently forced to close despite years of successful growth. There is an open adaptive virtual museum of informatics history in Siberia, a Russian online museum of computer history, a European virtual computer museum, the virtual computer museum in Russia, claiming over 2,000 daily visitors, a German website called Computer Archiv. They keep disappearing, right? The Australian Computer Museum was established in 1994 and quickly amassed a significant number of devices, but a mere decade later found that properly maintaining the hardware, software, and the oral history of an industry that began in the 1940s, 80 years ago now, presents multiple insurmountable challenges. They soon decided to pass along many items in their collection to other museums, including the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. And, you know, as two newspaper articles here tell you, they basically went under, they crashed. Other museums that started strong have either similarly faded or they faced warehousing problems, financing problems, or they decided to remain really small and therefore less capable of representing the full breadth and depth of computer history. The Monash Museum of Computing History, for example, founded in 2001, wisely chooses to collect and preserve only objects and information that reflect the development of the discipline at Monash University, right? Local. not even Australia, just Monash. Right? So this tension between selecting and being systematically representative characterizes often the museum, the computer history museum landscape. But imagine the loss 100 years from now if museums hadn't begun preserving the artifacts of the computer age. The last few decades offer proof positive of why museums must collect. This is what the Smithsonian Museum says. This is what the Science Museum in London says. This is what the National Museum of American History says. But they've only started saying it in the last 2.5 decades, in the last quarter century. Even as stout a defender of collecting and exhibiting historical computers in a museum setting as Dag Spicer, who's worked in leading roles for several museums, went on the record admitting that, quote, for the great majority of museum visits, people will increasingly use the web rather than travel to a physical location. Hence, even real museums now integrate their holdings, exhibits, education, and outreach programs into web-based knowledge architectures. But online access gives rise to another important aspect of the history of computing. Namely, online, we don't get to be in the presence of, we don't get to touch, we don't get to interact with any of those devices. What we get instead is emulation or simulation, right? And this is, of course, something that museums have had to do with either very badly damaged or very valuable devices. You can't afford, you can't allow interaction, you can't allow people to touch and interface with those older devices. So what you offer instead is either a replica or emulated software or simulation, right? So this is what's happening with computer pioneer Zuse, for instance, a German computer inventor who built a number of really influential machines in the 1930s, 1940s. Very few of them are actually extant. You can find replicas at various places in Germany, in Karlsruhe, in Berlin, in Kelkheim, in Frankfurt, in the Living Computer Museum in Seattle. But what you tend to get instead is either pictures, or if you want the interactivity, if you want an idea of what the look and feel of that older computer was like, you get emulation, you get simulation. Software emulation offers logical replication, which is very distinct from physical replication. Right? Historians have some legitimate worries about that. Right? It's a little strange that we can no longer distinguish between the original device and the emulation or simulation of it, the remake of that software. It's something kind of fake but true that we get. But when artifacts are too valuable, too old, too damaged, or too fragile to demonstrate interactively, then models and simulations are invaluable, and emulators have made great strides. The Living Computer Museum in Seattle, for instance, offers emulations of the very valuable and rare Apple II, the Macintosh SE, and others. From its inception, the Nixdorf Museums Forums planned to balance around 30 hands-on devices with at least the same number of multimedia installations and simulations, including the Commodore 64, MS-DOS, Windows, etc. They might not seem special in their own right, but after a few decades, it's interesting to see what was that actually like, and what did that look like, what did that feel like. So at the same time as museums try to keep up with decaying hardware, they also try to keep up with the history of ideas that went into computing, into interacting with computers, and into the web. One very interesting ancestral vision of the web that historians like to invoke is Paul Otlet's idea of the Mundaneum. This is also a museum, physically, in Mons in Belgium, in a small town in Belgium. It's a unique museum that can lay claim to making the story of the internet, in part, a Belgian story. because this institution, founded more than 100 years ago by Paul Hotelet and Henri Lafontaine, revolutionized the way documents are classified and connected. In 1934, a decade before Vannevar Bush published his ideas about a MEMEX, a memory extender computer network in the United States, 4 decades before Ted Nelson began working on Project Xanadu or Doug Engelbart sketched his NLS online system, Paul Hotelet had already published a giant volume, the summary of all of his research over 2.5 decades, a magisterial work of synthesis, a scholarly setup that would provide automated electromechanical access to microfiche data linking all the world's knowledge, right? So when Google tells you they give you all the world's knowledge, you can tell them, you know what, Paul Hotelet already did that 100 years earlier. They actually envisioned a range of affordances in the 1930s that we now call web, video conferencing, mobile telephones, cloud computing, and the workstation that Paul Hotelet sought to design uncannily anticipated a range of communication formats that are now really part and packet switch of our understanding of what we're doing right now, communicating on the internet. So Paul Hotelet's project of a universal book was to manifest the connections each document has with all others and to open that structure to further annotation and restructuring by each user. Since 1895, Hotelet had envisioned this as a kind of a master index or master bibliography of all the world's libraries, but he found a fatal flaw that all library systems shared. They stopped at metadata. He actually wanted to not just have the metadata, where things are, what things are, but the things themselves. So link up the content, the sources, the conclusions of all these books. He imagined that the network would eventually be accessible by phone lines, retrieving facsimiles that are projected onto a flat screen. And indeed, Hotelet foresaw what Vannevar Bush called for later in 1945 with this conception of a memory extender, namely this kind of reference network based not just on classification, but on association. Yet museum scholars have pointed out that the rediscovery of Hotelet, when did it happen? In the 1990s, as a forefather of the internet, was shaped by our current preoccupations and coincided with new understandings of media and of museums in the light of developments in new media and in computing. So in hindsight, we can say that despite the pivotal importance of Hotelet to our current interpretation, both of the features and of the bugs of the current shape of the net, visits to Mundaneum reveal that gap. Despite the multilingual documentation at the core of this project, there are fewer and fewer visitors each year to this actual physical place in Mons, and despite the effort to balance the authentic character of the original exhibits with contemporary elements, the overall impression hovers somewhere between nostalgia and neglect. If I could send you a smell, I would send you some kind of dust and kind of musty decay. This situation is even more radicalized when we consider net art as one use case for computer-savvy exhibition spaces, right? If there's a computer museum, they should deal with net art. If there is a museum of computing online, net art should have a place there. An argument could be made, in fact, that the audience for net art far exceeds visitor numbers at any given museum, right? Because more people have access to the net than have access to any given physical museum. Yet, some net artwork cease functioning in less than 5 months. A hybrid expression drawing both on the history of computing and on the history of art is museum representation of computing as art. Here is not the place to sort through all kinds of groupings and aesthetic arguments. If it sometimes seems as if museums are still having the same debates about the role of computing that they had in the 1960s or the 1990s, that doesn't imply a basic incompatibility between museum practice and network communication. Some people proposed computer-aided curating and as early as 1993. But soon they had to ask why it's much easier to get an entire museum collection on the internet than to get a single word of net art into a museum space. That site, by the way, from 1993 stopped working in 1995. 1 decade ago, a thought-provoking touring exhibition called Collect the World, the artists as archivists in the internet age, explored the impact of computer-mediated communications on visual arts, including works by writer Rips, a founder of an online collection of images, animations, and sounds and videos called Internet Archaeology. The flip side is illustrated by net art that deliberately plays on impermanence. Collaborative work like the Impermanence Agent, a software art installation that washes away gradually in the course of your exploring it, or works that I'm showing here on the slide, like Mark Napier's Digital Landfill, Garrett Lynch's Things to Forget, and William Pope L's The Black Factory. Even as such art about the internet was made and shared on the internet, the discussion about how to preserve the net and its native art scenes for later generation raised thorny questions. As Wolfgang Ernst warns, an archival language has yet to be developed for digitized networked artworks, though enthusiasts have set out to try and formulate it. Usually the people bringing museum exhibits online are not curators, but archivists or educators, and instead of an exploration of the net as an exhibition space, they follow models of collection management. Another issue is that a museum is not simply a repository, but provides context that helps tell stories. You can see different things next to one another and can process their juxtaposition with others. This can be done in a digital environment, but it doesn't always have the same impact. Despite all of these problems, many people continue to argue that the internet sort of does act as a museum of computing. If a museum, again, is defined as an institution that collects documents, preserves exhibits, and interprets evidence information to make it widely accessible, then yes, arguably, the internet has come to simulate those functions. Until the museum reconfigured computing and internet as special recollections, the net of computers itself served as the form of historic retention. But computer museums now increasingly rely on replica hardware and emulated software for simulating the heritage they curate, and there are major forces obscuring even those histories. Before the privatization of the backbone and the commercialization of the web, the understanding was that computer networks served basic research. Before the black boxing of apps and operating systems for several decades of bootstrapping and experimentation, the understanding was that computing served human needs, scientific needs, academic needs, research needs, industry needs. But now we're made to forget that. Of course, the internet has a history of computing, and it obviously wouldn't exist without computers, but by the very same token, it serves to cover up that infrastructural history. The enormous investments into the past as a past to be restored, maintained, and defended are in fact themselves a symptom of the doubt about our present. That is just one reason why excavating the media archaeology of this heritage is becoming more complicated. Even those who believe that the internet is by nature a kind of museum simultaneously worry that a museum of the internet preserving and elevating artifacts of the defining technoculture of our time inevitably makes interactive computer-mediated communication ever more homogeneous and exclusionary. I'm coming to my second to last slide here. The exploitation of the domain name system, the monopolization of the search engines and of the browsers, the withdrawal of governments from regulatory policy, the ascendance of platforms and of platform lobbyists, and the complete capture of mobile devices by surveillance all point in the directions rarely, if ever, represented in science museums. Along the same lines, computer history museums are far less likely to thematize open source software or hacking or computer activism than a very sanitized version that pleases their corporate sponsors. So as Lewis Mumford wrote about museums a century ago, by the patronage of museums, the ruling metropolitan oligarchy of financiers and office holders established their own claims to culture. More than that, they fixed their own standards of taste, morals, and learning. Computer history museums offer this paradoxical compensation for the destructive sweep of modernizing, the shocking progress of technical media that provokes a selective conservation financed by the profits from innovation. The impulses for aestheticizing historical technology originate in how the museum helps us react to industrial innovation by differentiating, even though musealizing technology creates a false sense of institutional continuity of the history of computing. Arguably, the fundamental impulse for the appearance and proliferation of computer history museums and of the musealization of the internet since the early 1990s is that this allows institutions to completely neutralize the history of computing to create a semblance of digital culture as sterile, historicized, closed. Yet the ideological dimension of museum exhibition invalidates the idea that its objects can be neutralized. For the museum's primary function of preservation and exhibition pivot around a translation from the primary language of computing into the secondary language of history. Musealization as a selective process produces surplus value, and the discourse around the history of computing and the history of the internet creates cultural capital. But it also creates a lot of real-world financial capital, which bankrolls those museums. And under the guise of preserving, protecting, and restoring computer history, these institutions then do not, in fact, rescue it from the abusive treatment of mercantile interests. It is how those museums themselves manufacture history in the image of what they pretend to withdraw computers from, namely the very social forces that brought computers into the museum and are continuously bringing the museum onto computer networks. Museums replicate these tensions of capital with its fits of accumulation and expenditure, stockpiling, and liquidation. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much for the talk. I know this is a subject that matters to you and also finds a way into different places like where you are now in Germany, and of course for us and Unisinos as well, and at UCI. I have a couple of questions, and already we are receiving some here at Q&A as well. My first question and comment is, you have a strong argument that you start with this idea of the Moebius strip between, I guess, this idea of the benefits of preserving and the traps that the preservation can bring, since it doesn't preserve maybe some outside stories, some context, and lacks to show us more layers on each and every hardware or website that is musealized, let's say. So in that sense, do you think that the examples you went through, do you think some of them are more likely to give us at least show us this paradoxical side, or do you think that it's there is no, we have to come up with another type of institution and not a museum to reveal these things? So this is one of my questions, and the other one is regarding what we've been talking about. Museums, either they are about Egyptian artwork stolen by Europeans, or they can be about computers. They somehow teach us something about what is memory, what is worthwhile to be preserved, and how does that challenge the way that we are being overwhelmed by memory pieces, you know that because that's my interest in research, that are spread out on these platforms that are privately owned, but they have this sense of being public, such as YouTube, that we treat it like Google and others, we treat as they were something public, but they're very much private. So to make it like what's the Museum of Twitter going to look like after Elon Musk bought it? So I'm wondering how internet, in terms of how it's being utilized by people putting their own memories or memories from the media inside these different platforms, are kind of challenging us in terms of thinking of what is memory, what should be preserved. And then the other side, you have the online museums as well, trying to come up with this simulation process. So these are my two initial questions.
Thank you very much. Two difficult and open-ended questions, and I feel like your second question already helps me answer the first question. But let's go back to the first one. Just because I'm critical of computer history museums does not mean that I think there needs to be another type of institution. There are recent institutions, they're only 30 years or so or less into their own development, and they're learning very quickly, and they're learning in part from criticism that you or I may have when we visit. They take different approaches. They have different mechanisms at their disposal. Some of them are learned from the history of museums, from the 17th, 18th, 19th century, 20th century museum of science, or museum of art, or museum of natural history, or whatever. But very quickly, those methods also are quite obviously not ideal for computers and for communication and for the internet. Right. So in the 19th century, when Nietzsche asks, what's the use of history for life? He distinguished between three modes, three approaches: a monumental history that celebrates very selected great achievements, an antiquarian history that loves old stuff for its own sake because it's old, and a critical history that separates the useless from something that it can be useful in the future. Right. So when we try to apply that to how we see institutions cope with the history of computing, which is still a young field of inquiry, we can easily recognize in many museums and in many publications the temptation to reduce that very complicated story to great people or influential machines. And that's didactically valuable. It gives us access to some landmarks, but it also obscures all the people who helped those supposedly great people, their spouses, their lab partners, their financiers, their opponents, etc. When they take the antiquarian approach, here's something you've never seen and you'll never see again because nobody has it and it never worked. That's interesting to experts. It's interesting to people who are already knowledgeable about those milestones, the landmarks, and they want to fill in the gaps. But it can also be very kind of musty and dead, because those are dead ends of history. They don't lead to where we are today. Listicles of great inventors, of great machines, or of things that are really rare and that you'll never find, put old devices under protective glass. That all does very little to foster understanding of the stakes today, right? And your second question points at the really central, pivotal stake, which is, cultural memory. How do we remember? How much do we remember? And that's where I introduced the Möbius strip of, the Museum of Computing, but also Computing as Museum, because we remember more and more with the help of computers. And computers are changing our metaphors for how we remember. It used to be, scriptural metaphors, and then it was visual image metaphors, catalog metaphors, archival metaphors. And now we have a lot of metaphors that derive from our experience of interacting with network computing. So the third mode, the third approach that Nietzsche considered, critical history, would neither gossip about computer history nor generalize from a few big things about history, but it would search for validity claims that we can interrogate, for promising models and thought experiments to evaluate. And it would prize discontinuity over this apparently logical line that leads to today, because that then very dangerously suggests that you can forget everything because there's a logical line extension of that line that leads to tomorrow, right? So critical history really needs us to have more capacity of memory. I'm sorry if I'm commingling your two questions here, right? But that's when memory becomes a really important aspect of what we do in academia and what we do in life in general as well. You can see people make a pedagogical or didactic case for the few big things that stand out. You can see people do make a scholarly case for having everything represented. But critical history allows us to say, okay, what stands out as we tell and retell these stories, right? And the flip side of relying more on computers to remember things, phone numbers, email addresses, everything that you look up in Wikipedia pages, because maybe your parents knew that, but you don't need to remember it. You can just look it up. It's at your fingertips rather than in your head. Is that we tend to forget a lot more things, right? So when we study cultural memory, we have to also look at the flip side, which is forgetting. What do we forget? How quickly do we forget? What can we not forget? Computers themselves are very quickly forgotten. The computer that I'm working on right now is already several years old. It may not actually work for another 10 years. So pretty soon it'll be replaced by something that might be quite different. I can't necessarily anticipate what exactly that is, but the affordances and characteristics of our computers are changing, and we're not always in control. And we don't maybe even remember what earlier computers did for us or did not do for us. Earlier today, I was in a weird situation of booting up successfully my first computer that I ever got, a computer from 1987. And yes, it actually started up with a chime and the software loaded, which I did not expect. I was really shocked. I actually was going to throw that away, but it still works. That's a very rare experience for me. And it brings back memories about what that interaction was and what kind of expectations that raised for me in 1987 of interacting with computers. When, of course, the internet did exist, but the web did not. When, of course, we didn't use the computers exactly for the same kind of things that we use them for now. So to the extent that we want to maybe foster not just a memory culture, but a critical culture about computer-mediated communication, we should also look at some of the aspects of forgetting. When the industry wants us to forget about certain aspects, then I'm against that. But at the same time, if I had to remember everything about all the machines that I've ever used, that would be a burden, and I do need to forget certain things. Some files have to be erased.
Yeah, I agree with you. Thank you, Peter. I have 3 questions on the Q&A box here. So, Juliana, the first 2 ones are in Portuguese, so I will read them in Portuguese, and then our translator will translate them. This first one is from Aline Corso, a PhD student here from Unisinos. Se a necessidade de manter nosso patrimônio digital seguro para pesquisas futuras, memória cultural ou até evidências, a atualização de ferramentas e métodos técnicos representa uma carga crescente sobre as infraestruturas e métodos organizacionais, bem como sobre o ambiente ecológico. Como lidar com esse paradoxo? I guess, would you try to answer the first one? Because the other 2 ones are kind of big.
Are they not related? Okay, so this question is about digital heritage, patrimonio.
The paradox of how that increases the need of infrastructure and organizational methods. How does that impact the environment? So there's like a paradox between these 2 things. How to deal with that paradox?
There definitely is a paradox in the sense that our computers are using more energy and more resources to build. And what I was just talking about in answering Gustavo's question about obsolescence ties into that. We now see an industry that wants us to buy new computers and new cell phones, which are small portable computers, after less than 5 years, right? If I hold up my phone right now, you can't see what kind of model it is because they've become very similar to each other. But I'm no longer an early adopter for that very reason. That does not mean that I'm going to be going back to working on my computer from 1987, even though it booted up today. But yeah, it's a difficult trade-off in terms of ecological impact of computing. And of course, Bitcoin mining is particularly expensive there, but also gaming and other things that don't seem to be as easily defended in their ecological footprint. Museums have done a pretty good job at documenting the ecological footprint of computing. As a way of admonishing perhaps people who are not thinking about that when they play online games or when they buy new phones every other year, that this is contributing to environmental damage.
Okay, I'll read the next one from Daniel Petri, also former student of us and now professor in Universidade de São Paulo. Let me look at the question. Temos em museus uma variedade de retratos pessoais produzidos há décadas ou séculos atrás por artistas renomados, e outros nem tanto. Nesse instante, eu tenho 725 senhas salvas em meu Safari, uma dúzia de blogs iniciados, desatualizados ou perdidos pela web, além de contas em inúmeras plataformas que, por um momento ou outro, receberam meus inputs diários. Percebo que a plataformização que se instalou nas últimas décadas também trouxe uma maior segmentação de meu espaço pessoal online. À luz de lógicas como a coleta massiva de dados e a Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados, como você acha que os produtos pessoais, blogs, fotologs, etc., poderão ser exibidos em museus, visto que hoje existem atrasos de redes privadas e ou já perdidos e ou já proibidos de serem usados publicamente? So that's the question from Daniel.
I'm using my translation software to study the formulation, and I understand this to be a question about individual use of the net and the web, and how that might be preserved, or how much of that is already lost or is unable to be included in effort to preserve interaction on the internet in terms of the history of computing. That's a difficult thing to grapple with, because the easy answer might be to say we need competent curatorial decisions. For instance, I know this is not a question from America about America, or from the United States about the United States, but in the United States, the Library of Congress is preserving every tweet in English. I don't know if there's any Brazilian agencies that tries to do similar things. What about blogs? What about text messages, right? We do know that there are interests, commercial corporate interests that collect those data, but not because they think they might be historically valuable, only because statistically they're valuable for advertising purposes, and maybe they're not fully retained. We also do know that some security agencies might be interested in them, and they do retain things, right? NSA retains a lot of email and voicemail and other things like that, so that they can retroactively search. If it turns out next month that I am actually a terrorist, then my whole history of communication will be open to search. But museums do not have that capacity. Academics do not have that capacity. So all of these personal products, all these individual traces, if we do not ourselves keep them, will in fact probably be obsolete and forgotten, or even suppressed and erased very quickly. Increasingly, because as the question already points out, platforms are walled gardens. They're no longer cross-compatible. If you've been on Twitter or Facebook for a while, and then you stop using Twitter or Facebook, everything that you wrote, which is something that you wrote, will no longer be archived and no longer be accessible to you or anybody else for that matter. It's not erased because it's still statistically valuable to those corporations, but it's not accessible to a historian. It's not accessible, searchable for somebody who's a museum curator, unless we come up with curatorial strategies that say, we are particularly interested in social media in Portuguese, or we are particularly interested in blogs about particular topics, right? Right now, the approaches that I know about are not very robust. You can do web scraping. You can search Twitter and TikTok and other things by certain kind of hashtags, right? So if there's a hashtag, let's invent one right now, hashtag computer museum. I'm sure there's not much that you would find, but if that was an interesting hashtag, then you could come up with ways of preserving that across platforms. But right now, there's very little scholarship that's aiming in that direction. So it's a perceptive question, but I don't really have a good answer, sorry.
Thanks, Peter. I'll go ahead, and now I'm going to read. It's written in English, so you also can look at it, and I'll just read it here so we will have it shared with everybody. This is from Gabriel Palma. He's a master's candidate here in Unisinos as well. This year, I've heard about the 3G network shutdown. It is kind of strange to think about that because we assume that the 5G is just a new version, but they change fundamentally and are obviously not compatible with older devices. How do you think that we could emulate that period? The first applications developed for smartphones rely on that standard. Although we can use Wi-Fi, it is not guaranteed to work on older devices such as the iPhone 3G, for example. Do you think that would be possible to replicate types of networks as this to bring back to life the mobile internet of the 2010s?
Well, again, the cartoon caricature of Nietzsche that I offered a few minutes ago would say, approach one, exhibit all the most popular cell phones of the last 20 years, right? On a wall, and you can see, they become smaller and the screens become bigger and the buttons give way to a touch screen and other developments like that. But that doesn't really help. Approach two, we could try to preserve everything that there was, everything that was ever sold in 3G in Brazil, every device, whether it was made in China, in Korea, in Sweden, in Finland, etc., and show that there are some obscure ones and show what their capacities are, and sort of catalog that. That also doesn't really help bring back to life the mobile internet of the 2010s. And so the third approach that Nietzsche pointed to in the 19th century, for us 200 years later, what does that mean in the 21st century? A critical history of remembering, but remembering not everything and not just very selectively, but remembering in context, remembering so that the meaning of the story emerges. And that might be that it's not just about the devices themselves. It's meaningless to hang them up on the wall because they don't have any connections. So you want to preserve the look and feel of using that, right? And again, museums try to do that, some of them by showing the games that you played on your handheld, on your mobile device, some of them by showing what kind of social dimension those networks had or did not yet have. And you can do that by, reconstructing it through video. The look and feel is nicely captured sometimes in a video. If you can film a working device, or if you can use archival footage from those years. But emulation plays a big role there, simulating the operation of that old software on newer hardware, so that you get a look, maybe even on a brand new computer, at what that 3G phone from 2000 or from 2005 or from 2010 could do and could not do for you. That's the approach that museums are increasingly taking. And by the way, that's not really new. Emulation or simulation in software has been a practice since the 1960s, because there have always been incompatibilities between hardware and software. And companies and universities could not always afford to maintain everything. So they came up with shortcuts that used older data sets on newer machines. So that's what we could do if we wanted to illustrate, in your example, the 3G mobile internet of a while ago.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And then I have another one here. This one is in Portuguese. It's from Maxine, also our PhD candidate from Unisinos. Peter, ao abordar a preservação da história da computação, inevitavelmente a tua pesquisa recai na questão da nostalgia. Pergunto-me o quanto há de saudosismo nesse processo, que tanto pode gerar uma romantização de artefatos do passado, quanto impulsionar um olhar crítico para a evolução da tecnologia. Como é dosar essas relações nostálgicas enquanto pesquisador? Quanto a nostalgia tem influenciado a tecnocultura?
It's a great amount of influence, there's no doubt. I have just come back from looking at the history of an early exhibition of computers in Switzerland. where they said, oh, we now have history of computing because the first generation of people to have personal computers in the 60s and 70s are now collecting them in the 80s and 90s. And now those collections are becoming too big for them, so they donate them to museums, right? So the entire explanation for why we have computer history museums was nostalgia in that case. I don't really believe that, but it's definitely an influence. It's definitely something that leads to certain formations, like the formation of the exhibitionary impulse that I talked about, saying, you know, look what I have collected over the course of my career. In the case of these computer pioneers, it could be, you know, pride, you know, nostalgic pride. Look what I have achieved over the course of my career. In the case of other people, it could be, I want to remember my youth. I want to remember when I was in the basement playing on these machines when they still ran. I want to bring them back to life. But nostalgia can also lead us very badly astray. It can mislead about what actually happened and what it actually felt like, right? We all, depending on our age, can probably remember early interactions with computers, early encounters with the internet or with people on the internet, and what that felt like. That does not necessarily mean that we accurately remember them, right? So sometimes nostalgia is something that we have kind of invented along the way, a nostalgia for something that never really existed. I see that quite a lot in media history in general, because media are quite powerful at firing up the greatest graphics engine there is, namely our imagination, whether we're talking about television or film or digital media. Nostalgia often generates a past that never happened. So we have to be very vigilant, especially when museums say, you know, this is a fix for your nostalgia. This is going to help you return to those scenes, those happy scenes of your childhood or of your youth. That's probably not the case. A nice illustration of that is that just recently, somebody who had for a long time claimed to have the high score in a particular video game, a console game, was found out to have used emulation instead, right? So with forensic investigation of the resulting file that was submitted as evidence of a high score on this particular console game, you can show that there are small but significant discrepancies between using the original hardware with its own tact rate and software and using emulation software that allows the original code to run on hardware with much higher tact rates. But you get certain visual artifacts that distort. Not to say that one's better than the other, but that raises the question: is a record in this game as valid if I play not on the original hardware, or is it only valid when I do play on the original hardware? Right. So we have all of these tools, technical tools that seek to take us back, serious scholarship is always going to be very, very careful around the pull of nostalgia.
All right, thank you, Peter, once again. I don't know if we have any other questions. You see on our YouTube channel as well. So I'll just have one final thought. This one I shared with you a couple of days ago through email, and I'm just wondering about that quote on your talk about this translation, when you say, for the museum's primary functions of preservation and exhibition pivot around a translation from the primary language of computing into the secondary language of history. And I ask you about, would there be a third language in this mix? There will be the media language or the communications language or the platform language, depending on what trend word is around us. So my final question goes in that direction. And maybe I'm being a little insisting too much on this, but are we doomed to have this third layer of media mixing with these other, let's say, more traditional layers of museum and computing, or history and computing?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think to push me on that metaphor of translation, I still like the metaphor, even though you probe there. I still like the idea that people who are engaged in computing and advancing computing as it is used by us all right now, they're not engaging with computers in the way that I am. And I'm not capable of understanding everything that they do. So I would say that there are maybe two languages, two approaches, two ways of perceiving that. But at the same time, I also like the metaphor that I opened with, or that I quoted from Jeff Bowker, which is that these things are like a Möbius strip, right? They're distinct, but they end up with each other. Me now are almost, exclusively computational, right? What we still call cinema is really made with computers, distributed with computers. What we call television really is most likely heavily digital, from the camera to editing to where you watch it and how you watch it, perhaps even on a mobile device on the bus. So these are the media of our memory. These are computing devices, and we have to be very careful not to forget that they are digital media and what that means and what distinction that makes, because sometimes it's very clear to me that marketing and platform lobbyists want to make me forget what that is and what it could be. They want me to be satisfied and excited with about what they give me, and not ask for what I think they should give me. So that's where the translation metaphor breaks down, because it's simply two different horizons of expectation. And my horizon, quite naturally, as somebody whose primary affiliation in academia is in the humanities, is a historical one. I'm not a historian, but I'm interested in the history of media, the history of computing. I don't work for a museum either, and I have some questions about how museums do the work that they set out to do. But institutions set their own targets, right? In academia, we set our own targets together as colleagues. In museums, in that institution, they set their targets. And in computer companies, they set their expectations. But there's a power differential, right? When somebody decides what Meta or Google or Microsoft are doing, that decides for billions of people. Whereas if I make a decision in academia, that does not impact billions of people. So that power differential is, maybe you're correct, is not as much a translation as, talking alongside one another and not quite understanding each other. But I do think that they're sort of woven into each other, and that For that reason alone, to come back to your very first question, I think we are within our rights to criticize and maybe even complain about what is happening both in computers and computing and in museums. I see that there's a new question.
Yeah, from Roberta, and now there's another one from Sonia. So I'll start with Roberta's. Read that in Portuguese. Considerando o contexto da plataformização, essas grandes empresas de tecnologia também poderiam ser caracterizadas como museus de informações pessoais, pois quando se perde a conta, automaticamente se perde um histórico pessoal. Qual a sua opinião sobre as plataformas se tornarem museus de informações pessoais de usuários?
I don't think that the platforms themselves can possibly perform the function that I've been asking about, the function of really evaluating critically what the history of our interaction that is computer mediated means, where it's come from, where it goes. Yes, you could say, they have the information they collected automatically. That does not mean that these platforms become museums. They could collaborate with museums. They could voluntarily open up to a curatorial approach, but they very rarely do. When that does happen, it's often because a company has given up a particular product. Right? Again, the history of games comes to mind. Certain kind of games that are no longer maintained are then sometimes taken over by the effort, a collective effort to musealize, to preserve, to protect, but only because it's no longer commercially viable. As long as things are commercially viable for platforms, they're not interested in closing the book on that and exhibiting it or preserving it or explaining it. Their primary interest is in commercial exploitation. So I would not look to platforms for any of the functions that I've been asking about.
Okay. Last but not least, a question from Sônia Montanho, nossa querida colega, que está nos acompanhando também. Sônia, um beijo para ti e muito obrigado pela tua pergunta aqui também, em nome de todos nós alunos aqui, professores. Ela congratula o Peter pela reflexão que nos provoca e quer conversar sobre o conceito de história crítica. O conceito de história crítica parece algo que nos retira das experiências em si para compreender as condições dessa experiência. Por exemplo, perceber que uma determinada história narrada em um museu ou de qualquer outra forma é algo monumental ou é um culto ao antigo, seria uma história crítica, que percebe as condições em que se dão essas narrativas. A história crítica nos leva, de alguma forma, a perceber como cada meio nos faz perceber a nós mesmos em nossa época?
Yeah, I think that's more or less exactly what I wanted to point to, not just about our own time, but the context that we want to think ourselves in, which includes past, but possibly also future horizons, right? Now, I'm probably one of the older people here, so maybe I don't have as much future horizons as some other people participating on this Zoom call. But we don't stop when we imagine when we imagine ourselves, when we think about context. We don't stop at today. We always extrapolate into the future, but we should also perhaps learn, and this is one of the benefits of academia, learn to go back further, right? So I feel more and more that my contribution to academic conversations is not just to make jokes about how old I am. I'm perhaps not, but I joke about it nonetheless because I want students to expand the horizon that they interpret by including a lot more of the past than they typically do. And that is both a conceptual and a historical horizon that can then calibrate our expectation from today and from tomorrow, right? So if I better understand the history of a particular medium, whether it's video or audio, or different forms of writing, or in this case, the history of computing, then I can also better understand what is the range of options that might take me into the better direction in the future, right? In some cases, that seems particularly difficult because of the environmental impact that other questions already pointed out. But that's not the only worry that we have currently. You know, there is a massive wave of disinformation, especially on social media, forcing us to imagine a different kind of configuration of social media that does not hand us over to dark influences, commercial or political. There are all kinds of other worries that highlight that, you know, Ted Nelson's not the only one to say that the internet and the web as we use it today are sadly falling short of the ideas that some of the pioneers that set that process in motion were pursuing. And that doesn't mean that we just fold our hands and say, you know, we're resigned to how badly it went. It could mean that we teach each other and we teach ourselves to see ourselves in a completely different interaction with media, right? So as the question says, not just perceive how each medium makes us perceive ourselves and our time, but also perceive how it could be different. It could have gone differently. Museums are very good at showing that, by the way, you know, counterfactual alternative paths for the history of technology, which also then have consequences for the history of interactions between us.
Okay. I'll say we have one last question from the YouTube chat. It's from Augusto, our PhD candidate. I also sent you that on the chat itself, your private chat on Zoom. He's asking, I'll change to Portuguese. Sou ilustrador e animador, e os trabalhos que fiz usando lápis e papel há mais de 20 anos ainda estão acessíveis em uma caixa sobre meu guarda-roupas. Mas os trabalhos que fiz usando softwares... Perdão, ficou aqui cortado. Os trabalhos que fiz como softwares como Flash, ou os que guardei em zip drives ou CD, não consigo mais acessar. É possível dizer que a obsolescência na era digital envelhece nossos arquivos mais rapidamente?
Is it possible to say that obsolescence is going faster? Yes. Is that objectively true? I don't know. I mean, there are arguments among historians that show that our perception of our time is always somewhat inflected by our lack of knowledge about, you know, prior generations and their possibly quite rapid change. We don't remember it as rapid because, again, we look back and we say, oh, these are the big developments that characterized the 19th century or the 20th century. And we don't see the year-by-year changes that they went through, the abandoned media that might have played a role in their age. But I do think that you're not wrong. I do think that digital technology does aim for planned obsolescence. That's been a driving factor in the making and selling of the devices and in getting us hooked on the next iteration of those devices, right? The upgrade cycle. but breaking it is very difficult. Slowing it down is very difficult, especially if, as in your case, it's a professional tool. You need to be up to date. We sometimes can afford to say, I don't need to have the latest type of car. I don't need to have the latest type of computer. But if it's a professional tool that I use to make my living, then I can't fall too far behind, right? One movement there that's interesting is the right to repair, right? Right now, if I pull up my phone, no advertisement intended, and show it to you, you will see, just because I flashed the brand logo to you for a second, that it's not something that I have the right to open up and modify. It will break all kinds of rules, and it'll mean that nobody else is going to help me if something goes wrong. That didn't used to be the case. We used to have the right to repair a radio, a television, a computer when it breaks, and we had the means to them, and it wasn't that expensive, and you didn't have to go to a genius. You could try to do it yourself, or you could try to help each other. And if we could get back to that, then maybe we can slow down the real or perceived rapid obsolescence of our digital tools.
Okay, then we are almost out of time, and I would like once again to thank Peter Krapp from University of California, Irvine, now also on a visiting project in Germany, alongside with Eduardo, our dear friend as well, former student here from Unisinos. Peter, thank you once again for your talk, for giving us so much to think about and to discuss with you here. You had a lot of questions, and that shows us how important and relevant your talk was for us. I would like to invite everybody for our second day on tomorrow, on the 8th. We will have Lori Emerson from the Media Archaeology Lab, University of Colorado. She will talk about situated practices in the Media Archaeology Lab, and we're looking forward to hear her ideas as well. And now I will, Peter, once again, thank you. I know it's already very late in Germany, and you need your most your well-deserved rest after all this. I don't know if you want to address something else. And
thank you very much. Yeah, it's almost 11 at night, but that's not too bad. I'm not complaining. I'm happy to be talking about this. It's a new project for me. I wish I could have told you about a lot more of these museums that I'm visiting, that I'm researching, virtual ones and real ones that also have virtual representations. But the time is limited, and time is even more precious on Zoom. So thank you for attending, and thank you very much for the questions that also have given me some things to think about.
Okay, so I will switch quickly to Portuguese. Muito obrigado, então, a todos que compareceram no dia de hoje, tanto os nossos alunos, quanto aqueles que vieram pela nossa divulgação, e aqueles que também assistiram pelo YouTube, onde também vai ficar gravado o nosso primeiro dia aqui da 20ª Semana da Imagem, que é uma promoção, então, do Grupo de Pesquisa Audiovisualidades da Tecnocultura, Comunicação, Memória e Design. Tem o apoio da Escola de Indústria Criativa, do Instituto de Cultura Digital da Unisinos e também da CAPES, assim como de todos os alunos que estão envolvidos aí na divulgação e organização do evento. Obrigado, Duane, que está aqui no bastidor, ajudando na parte do webinar, assim como o Lucas aí representando os alunos aqui também nessa parte do staff, e a todo mundo. Nos falamos amanhã, então. Muito obrigado, um abraço a todos.